Since Alex and Julia are going to paint the coffee table base, I can pretty much use any wood I want to make the coffee table. I've chosen to reuse some Douglas fir salvage from a couple of old doors that were given to me by a friend. I already stripped off most of the paint of the doors and cut them down to a usable size, and you can see that they've already been milled squarish. I really only need to flatten one face on each piece and glue these together to make a leg that will end up about 75mm square. I'll take one face of each piece, hand plane it, and remove the milling marks from my jointer. Obviously, don't plane as fast as I did. Now, it's time to glue the leg together, so just put the glue on each face evenly and clamp the pieces together until the glue is cured. I leave mine at least a couple of hours, or preferably overnight. Notice how I use quite a lot of glue and spread it across both surfaces. You'll get a lot of squeeze out, but that's easily cleaned up with a damp cloth. So the glue is dried, and now we can joint the legs again so that one side is flat and 90 degrees to another. Then a quick run through the thicknesser will make the opposite faces parallel, and you end up with all four sides square. Just keep running the legs through the thicknesser until it's 75mm square. I finish up with a hand plane to smooth the surface ready for joinery. If your hand plane is sharp and set correctly, you should end up with nice wispy shavings at this point. Then, simply square up the ends at the miter saw, but use masking tape to help reduce that tear out from the saw cut. Once the ends are square, I cut them to length by setting the stop on the saw, as this ensures they are all exactly the same length. As you can see here, the masking tape goes a long way to reducing tear out. Now that the legs are milled, we can move on to joinery. I learned a tip from Mark Spagnolo which involves putting a circle on top of the legs to show which orientation they go when marking out joinery. You can always check the orientation by noting the line of the circle will intersect the two inside faces. These are the faces the joinery will be on. Right front, right rear, and left front. Next, we mark out the joinery using a pencil. I used a Sharpie here so you can see it on camera. Now, I don't show all of the marking out here, but just make sure that you mark only the faces that have the circle on the end intersecting them. Also, ensure you mark out the panel groove. We'll cut that later with the router after we've done the mortises. There's really not much else to say here, except that yes, marking out does take a long time. Take your time, double check everything, put some crosses in where you're going to cut out, and that marks out the waist area so you don't get confused. It is so easy at this point to bugger something up. Now we can move on to actually cutting the mortises. I start by cutting the mortise for the bottom rail and the top rail on the sides. I then move on to cutting the groove in between the two mortises that will house the side panel. Now I'm using a 6mm router bit set with a 6mm depth of cut. Go slowly and you'll feel it pop into the mortise at the end. Now we can move on to cutting the mortise that will house the web frame support. I do this by using a 13mm router bit and cutting out the waist. With the router table, you can see here what I've done is mark the size of the router bit, the outside lines on the router table, so I know where I can start and stop. This method will get me reasonably close to the lines, and then all I do is finish up with a chisel. So just chisel out the extra waste right up into the line. Don't actually hit the line, but right up to it. Once you've chiseled out most of the waste, you can use the largest chisel you have and go right into that line to get a nice, crisp, clean cut. Now we can move on to cutting the mortise for the bottom shelf. Now I've decided to cut this mortise with hand tools, and what I've done is mark it out with a knife. I cut with a chisel right up to that knife wall. Then I can use the saw, place it into that knife wall, gives me a nice straight cut, and chisel out the waste. Now this part's fairly easy, you can just hack at it with a chisel. Make sure your chisel's nice and sharp though. Stay well away from the lines on the inside as you can see, and then right at the end you can get a nice clean square cut. So there we are, legs are complete, we've cut all the mortises. I'll be looking for you in the next episode where I make the rails and the panel for the sides and glue them to the legs.